If I told you that 1 in 5 people in your workplace had some real potential and strengths, but they were struggling to show them to you, and you might actually be thinking that they were poor performing, and they might feel like they were swimming against the tide and getting frustrated, so they might actually be thinking of leaving. They might actively be leaving your workplace. You'd probably want to know who that 1 in 5 are and what you have to do in order to keep them in your workplace and realise that potential. Let me tell you my story. When I was at school, I felt like I was swimming against the tide. I was a really slow reader, so I didn't jump into the books like my friends did. As a result, I was less articulate, I didn't have such a wide vocabulary, and I really struggled to kind of have the same wider knowledge. I was just bottom of the class the whole time. It ruined my self-esteem and my confidence, and I just struggled to get through it. But somehow I crawled through further and higher education. When I got to the world of work, though, it was a completely different matter. There were no essays, there were less books, and there was just a wealth of work to do. It was long hours, it was hard work, but I just didn't mind because I had all the energy I needed, and there was just problems to solve, people to lead, there was opportunities to spot, and I loved it. I was thriving. I didn't feel like swimming against the tide at all. And before I knew it, I was promoted and promoted and promoted, which was pretty confusing because this girl that was always bottom of the class was suddenly doing pretty well. But before I knew it, I achieved my first personal goal, which was to become a director by the age of 30. And that was fantastic, but not for long, because before I knew it, I had that familiar feeling of kind of swimming against the tide again. And what I found in this role was that there was a lot more structure and admin and process and bureaucracy and red tape. And this was slowing me down and frustrating me. On top of that, I had always found that I really lent into my relationships. Things like body language, tone of voice, facial expression, this was what I lent on to build up relationships around me. And when I got to this role, I started to see that there was another game at foot here, which was politics. And so it was deceptive. It was not what I was seeing and picking up on. All the vibes I was picking up on were not always correct. And to make matters worse, I was actually getting feedback in my reviews, like, Sally, you're a starter, not a finisher. You need to lean in more to the details of things. And I wanted to be my best. I wanted to do this so much. So a bit like a fish, I stopped swimming and I started to try to learn to ride a bike. And I really focused on riding that bike. I really focused on trying to sort out these issues that I had. But it was getting me down, and I started to lose my value because spotting opportunities, delivering commercially, that was what I did when I was swimming. But I wasn't swimming anymore, I was learning to ride a bike. So I kind of accepted, I've reached the ceiling of my capability here in the corporate environment. And I resigned with no job to go to. My boss, my colleagues, my parents definitely, were all horrified, shocked. Sally, why would you throw away your career when you're doing so well, you're on track? But I knew that this environment was affecting my self-esteem, my confidence, and I wasn't thriving. So I joined Nick, my business partner, and together we formed the agency Something Big, and I soon was running a small business. In the world of small business, there's no politics, there's no red tape, there's a lot less structure, and you wear so many hats that you are, you know, the variety of what you're doing, the opportunities to spot, the problems to solve, it's relentless. And I started to bring up my family, so I was still soon juggling a young family of 3 young children and the relentless needs of this running a business. And I loved it. I was thriving again. So a decade on, my husband and I and teachers started to spot some very familiar behaviours and traits in our children. And soon the doctors were diagnosing us with a whole wealth of neurodiverse labels: dyslexia, OCD, Tourette's, and perhaps most significantly, ADHD. And soon my whole life and that education experience and that experience of the corporate environment came into very sharp focus. And I thought, how could things have been different in that corporate environment? How could I have thrived? Are there other people with neurodiverse conditions in the workplace struggling like me? Are other organisations losing talent from the workplace because they're swimming against the tide? And how will my children thrive in the workplace? 1 in 5 of us are neurodiverse. That is a huge community given the low awareness and tiny amount of support that we have in the workplace. Just 10% of employers consider neurodiversity in the community, in their workplace. In fact, 52% of employers say that they might not actually recruit and employ a neurodiverse person. And a whopping 86% of managers say that they feel completely unequipped to be able to support their employees with neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is a name and an umbrella term for a number of conditions that affect the way that the neurodivergent brain functions in comparison to a neurotypical brain. It covers conditions like dyslexia, OCD, ADHD, as I've mentioned, but also Asperger's, autism, ODD, PDA, and loads more. And many of these conditions coexist. For example, I have dyslexia and ADHD. Of course, like any group of community that's under or misrepresented, there are lots of misinformation. I hear lots of people say to me, "Oh, I'm a bit OCD about that. Oh, I can't concentrate. Oh, I'm a bit hyper today." Aren't we all neurodiverse? And actually, it's really important that we appreciate the difference. And of course, yes, we all multitask and we all have times where we can't concentrate. But the neurodivergent brain is what is called a spiky profile. In our personality, we have a number of traits, and our brain function has many, many functions, from motor skills to impulse control, emotional control, literacy skills, etc. And in the neurodivergent brain, what we see is extreme spikes in a particular strength, in a particular trait. And that means that for a neurodiverse person, it is far more difficult for them to just simply switch it off. Someone with OCD can't simply stop that routine because they're running late for work. Somebody with dyslexia can't suddenly read faster because they're in a recruitment process. Somebody with Asperger's can't explain their feelings just because it's date night. And someone with ADHD simply can't just calm down. What we can do at times is mask certain traits of our conditions. For example, I know that when I'm in a meeting that's important and there's somebody senior talking and it's really inappropriate for me to interrupt, I can mask and manage my impulse control for a short period of time. And it's a bit like if you're suppressing a yawn or a blink. I can do it for a short period of time, but what it means is I have to concentrate on it. And while I'm concentrating on it, I'm not listening to the meeting because I'm concentrating on not interrupting. Now, of course, as I've grown up, I've learned tricks, like I'm writing copious notes so I don't speak up. But it's also quite exhausting. So masking our traits in the workplace is something we can do, but it takes time and effort and takes us away from our strengths. We also see that in media, of course, the neurodiverse community has lots of stereotypes. You'll see that anybody with Tourette's that's ever represented in media is always seen as someone who's swearing. And actually, less than 10% of the Tourette's community have that part of the condition. You'll see that anybody with autism or Asperger's is seen as an eccentric genius. You'll see maybe Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang, who's a Nobel Prize winning physicist with no social skills. And of course, we have to just remember that these stereotypes are really exaggerated for comedy and drama purposes. Now, it is true that there are a number of legendary high performers in this community. We can date back to Einstein, Darwin, Newton. All of these people are now seen as being part of the neurodiverse community. And more recently, we've got Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Richard Branson, and Steve Jobs, who are all open that they have been part of the neurodiverse community. So it's really clear that there are some huge strengths, and when we put people in the right environment and give them the right support, there is a huge potential in this neurodiverse community. But remember, 1 in 5 of us are neurodiverse. 1 in 5 of us are not Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, and Richard Branson. So there are clearly a huge proportion of people who are in your workplaces struggling to show you their strengths, potentially swimming against the tide. And remember, there's 86% of managers who are feeling completely unequipped to be able to support them. So it's really clear that we have a huge community here with lots of potential, but potentially suffering in silence, swimming against the tide, and struggling to show you their potential. I think to move on, what we really need to do is unravel how we can get the benefit of this community. I think there are 3 really big barriers, and I think the first one is diagnosis. At the moment, there is a 400% increase in diagnosis of neurodiverse conditions in adults in the UK alone. This has meant that there's a huge waiting list. It could be over 5 years for anyone to get through the process. In fact, the highest proportion of diagnosis is in female adults, and that's because boys represent ADHD or present ADHD in a different way. They're boisterous and disruptive in class. Girls were seen as daydreamers and chatterboxes, and diagnosis was missed altogether for many of them. But the problem with diagnosis is that many organisations still hold policies that say they won't support or acknowledge any neurodiversity in the workplace without formal diagnosis. And realistically, formal diagnosis isn't for everyone. For some people, it's very important that they get protection in employment rights and maybe the support they need in wider life. But for other people like me, I'm self-recognised. I don't need the label. I understand my condition, and I've been able to understand it a lot more since I learned how to support my children. But the assessments for diagnosis in some cases are pretty out of date, maybe not fit for purpose, and the journey is quite unsettling. So I think my first barrier that we can overcome in the workplace is to prevent ourselves from thinking that we have to have formal diagnosis before we provide support. We need to provide support for undiagnosed, undisclosed, and also unrecognised people. So support for everyone, for all. So my second area is recruitment. It is really clear that this is a major barrier. I'm not sure that our recruitment processes are giving our neurodiverse colleagues a fair chance to show how they can perform. And for many people, we may not even be trying to go for jobs because of this recruitment process. If you consider giving a timed written test, an assessment to someone with dyslexia, is that a fair chance for them to show you what they're capable of? If you consider giving someone with Tourette's a telephone interview only, where maybe on the telephone, under that extreme pressure, their verbal tics may be well exaggerated. If you consider maybe interviewing someone with Asperger's in a noisy environment with food smells, with loud noises and bright lights, their sensory is so overloaded that they're so distracted they can't show you what their potential is. So I think the second area we can work on is recruitment, and we clearly have some discrepancies there. In fact, the neurodiverse community underperforms and under-benchmarks when it comes to employment. Do you know that people with autism are actually only 29% of adults are employed in either full or part-time work, despite desperately wanting to be welcomed into the workplace. So we are clearly falling very short in this area. And my third barrier is disclosure. And of course, 52% of the community are not ever disclosing their conditions to their employers, and they wouldn't, because they feel it's career limiting, it's going to take the focus away from their strengths and focus on their weaknesses. We're not going to overcome the stigma of disclosure unless we can massively manage the psychological safety in the environment, and that's going to take us time. But things like today, me talking openly about my ADHD, and the more we talk about it, the closer we'll get. But I hope that we get to a stage where much more people feel that they can disclose. So if you're listening today and you're thinking, well, I'm an HR professional or an internal communications specialist or leader, and you're thinking, this is great, but how on earth do we get all of this happening in our workplace? I think there's a number of things we can do, and I think they come in order. I think the first thing we can do is acknowledge this community and educate. And when I say educate, we need to educate our entire organisation, from leaders to managers to supervisors to colleagues to HR professionals to internal comms specialists, recruiters. Let's all become really great allies to this community. I think the second area that we can acknowledge and recognise is accommodations and adjustments. The things that we can do, there are hundreds of things we can do in the workplace to make the environment a better place and an easier place for people within this community, so that they can swim with the tide, not against it. And I think what's really important here is this is not soft landings, this is not special treatment, this is not allowing poor performance, this is accessing better performance. So this can be things from simple things like using technology, text-to-speech, read-back functionality in technology, but this can be creating really quiet spaces in the workplace where people can work. This is changing people's schedules so that they're not commuting at busy times, that they find that their senses get overloaded. This is allowing people to wear noise-cancelling headphones. It's simple things that cost very little money. And what we need to do here is not just allow them, but we need to normalise them for everyone to make this a more inclusive place. I think the third thing I'd like us to do is to really enable ourselves to get to know the neurodiverse community. I understand that there's a barrier to disclosure, but as people come forward, as they speak up, as they perhaps feel more comfortable to be themselves, we need to create networks of neurodiversity. This would have been the most powerful thing that I could have experienced in the workplace two decades ago. I doubt I would ever have left the workplace had I have understood that I was not alone and that other people could have supported me. And those networks will give vital information to employers about how to make the workplace better for them. So I think networks of neurodiverse communities. And then I think we also really need to celebrate the potential of this community. They are misunderstood. ADHDers are often seen as lazy because they start things and they don't finish them. It's not a matter of laziness, it's a matter of concentration and focus. People with autism and Asperger's are often misunderstood. In fact, the number one reason that people with autism leave the workplace is not because they can't do their jobs, but because they can't fit into the culture. This is a most isolating environment for this community, which is such a shame because we're making huge strides on inclusion in the workplace. So we have to get a handle on this community. When we can understand them and we can tap into the potential and strength of this community, we will see the benefits and we will be able to celebrate that in the workplace. And as I close, what I want to say is be part of the 10% of businesses that are seeing the potential of this community and realising that potential and that strength and outperforming competitors because they are finding that potential. Don't be part of the 90% that are not acknowledging this community, that are making these people swim against the tide and leave their business to go to other competitors. This is a fantastic community. Let's celebrate them and be great allies. Thank you.